Hi, I'm Ray Evernham, NASCAR Championship winning crew chief and member of the NASCAR Hall of Fame. And you're at the Big Iron Garage. And Big Iron Garage is where, well, we just have a lot of fun. This car is really special. This is the car, the original car that Buddy Baker broke the 200-mile-per-hour barrier. The first car ever to go 200 miles per hour on a closed circuit. Before IndyCar did it, before anybody did it, Buddy Baker did it in a NASCAR stock car at Talladega, March 1970. This car actually was DC-93, they called it. It was the Chrysler test car. It was used for a lot of different things. It actually raced in some races by guys like Richard Brickhouse, Bobby Allison, Buddy Baker. Even Dan Gurney test drove this car. So it's got a lot of, again, a lot of history. Big old Chrysler Hemi in there, which was the signature of the day. This car was restored, went out to Don White, and actually ran dirt tracks. It ran USAC races and ARCA and lots of different things. But this is the actual nose, fenders, hood, even some of the ductwork off this car. My partner in this car, Greg Kwiatkowski, has spent almost 3 decades tracking down every nut, bolt, decal, everything he could find. We've been restoring this car for almost 2 years. It has many of the original parts. Greg has photos of everything. Greg worked at Chrysler for years and got access to some of the original notes from the day that this car broke 200 miles per hour. This car was painted several different colors, so when we restored it, we actually painted it using the same process that they did. And then eventually, it broke the record that day. The car right now is very representative of the day it broke the record. I've been around NASCAR stock cars for quite some time. I love the big wing cars, and I'll tell you that this may be the most accurate per date restoration that I've ever worked on. These cars were special. Everybody knows that they worked on them, the aerodynamics. That big wing in the back helped with a lot of stability. It wasn't just downforce, it was stability. And this nose certainly cut the air. You know, made it, again, aerodynamic. But some of the things that, when you look past it, that Chrysler did, venting the front fenders, that added as much downforce to the front probably as that nose. You know, little things like this chin spoiler, the way that it worked with this big Dodge Daytona nose. And underneath, this car has 4 different levels of how the front ductwork was put in, and each one of those levels does something else aerodynamically. So they were pretty advanced. I said that big Hemi engine certainly didn't slow it down at all, but these guys also were very sharp on what they did with the front end. You know, Chrysler at that time was very, very advanced with their race car building, their data. They were actually one of the first companies to put 2 cars in the wind tunnel nose to tail to see how the second car was affected by the first. This car, it's been called the Purple People Eater, but it's not. This is one of my favorite cars. This car was driven by Dick Trickle in 1975 in the 1975 Daytona 500, and it was owned by an independent, a family, Del and Diane Puro, right from here in North Carolina. This car is a Banjo Matthews chassis, 115-inch wheelbase. It is actually a Mercury, 1973 Mercury body. And you can see, when we were talking about the 69 Daytona, things have changed a lot. The wings were outlawed, the big Hemi engine, the big cubic inches were outlawed from 426 to 351 cubic inches. Little spoiler on the back of this car, flat nose, but these cars were still pretty good. Some guys out of Stewart, Virginia, named the Wood Brothers, won a lot of races with cars that looked just like this one. And again, this was a very fast car. Back then, still had chrome bumpers. Glass windshields. That's something that we just don't use anymore, but back then, one of the ways that NASCAR controlled guys maybe wanting to cut up the roofs or narrow the cars, if a stock windshield fit, they knew that they didn't, you know, move the roof, the A-pillars and things like that. This car's got a lot of really cool history. Not only did Dick Trickle drive it, but this was driven at Charlotte Motor Speedway that same year, 1975, by another famous guy named Bobby Isaac, who has a great history in racing. So even though this car doesn't have a long winning history, things like that, It was driven by some great drivers and represents what the backbone of NASCAR to me is, the independent racers. This car, through the years, had a body change. It was driven by Richie Ponch in many races. We found it. It was in a storage trailer where it had sat for 30 plus years. We found it, drug it out, put it back to the original condition that Dick Trickle drove it in, and we plan on driving this thing around too. What you're looking at here is probably the purest, most unrestored Jeff Gordon race car that exists outside of Hendrick Motorsports. This is Booker. This is our 1994 Daytona 500 car. We finished 4th in the 94 Daytona 500, and we finished 8th, I think, in the July 4th Firecracker race. This car sat in a museum for quite some time, and when it came here, it needed a little bit of TLC to get it running, but it had, as we dug into it, had many of the original parts and pieces, and including Jeff's seat, the pedals, the brakes, all those things. We had to find a Hendrick engine for it, which we found many of the original pieces from a Hendrick engine and had it restored. And if you look at this car, back then the crew chiefs used to have to work on the car, and I was the aluminum welder. So a lot of my welding and fabrication were in this car. We were drilling holes and doing these things. The more I look at this car, the more it reminds me of how much fun it was to build cars back then in the early days. At Hendrick, we pretty much built everything. We built the cars, we built the engines, bodies, transmissions, and gears. So this is a pure Hendrick racer, and again, 94 was a special year for Jeff Gordon and I, because it was the year that we won our first race together at Charlotte not too long after that, and we finally started to perform in the restrictor plate races. Our Daytona and Talladega cars were very different from the rest of the cars that we used to race, and the rules were pretty lax back then. You could move the bodies around, you could move the frame rails around, things you just can't do now. So we used to move the bodies way forward on the speedway cars, and we'd make them real round so that they didn't create a lot of drag. Couldn't run them anywhere else. This car ran Daytona twice, finished 4th in the 500, 8th in the July 4th race, and ran Talladega twice, where I think we wrecked it. But it seemed like we always wrecked it at Talladega for some reason. At the end of that year, if you remember, from 94, we switched from the Lumina to the 95 Monte Carlo. So this car was sold at the end of the year, and what was really neat, I haven't seen this car since 1994, so it was great to see it again. I don't remember ever wanting to do anything but work on cars. And I love all types of cars. I've always wanted to race, be a race driver, be involved, but at the same time, I love classic cars, and I love the history of the sport. It always motivated me. I know growing up, a lot of kids were football, baseball, and things like that. And my dad actually played semi-pro football and baseball, and I think I broke his heart when I told him I wanted to be a racer, but it's what motivated me. There's just something about the cars, the design, the story. When you have a competition mechanically, I think it's different than having a competition in sports. Something you're doing physical with your body. Would love to have been able to drive like Jeff Gordon or A.J. Ford or Mario Andretti, but I wasn't given those gifts. The things that I were good at was really doing things mechanically in that challenge, and being able to compete as a crew chief or build a car that you knew could compete for a championship or compete for race wins. And there is no better feeling than when you build a car and you hand it off to someone who you know there's no one in the world that could drive that car any faster than that person. And always had that kind of relationship with Jeff Gordon. And working with Jeff really fueled my competitiveness, because I knew that if I gave him a car that could win, he was going to win with it. And that was a lot of fun, being able to go to the racetrack, certainly every Sunday, thinking that. You learn a lot of lessons, and one of the lessons I've learned, and I try and tell people all the time, you may not get there as fast as you want, but I don't know anyone who's ever worked on a car long enough or hard enough that finally didn't win with it. We're just going to keep fixing up these cars. Wish you the best and look forward to seeing you in the future.